Saltify and Sapience Institute present The Double Standard Media Reactions to Zionist Terror by Jody Mcyntyre and Mohammad Hijab. Narrated by Ahmed Alauddin. Supervised by Sadiq Zaman. Introduction. In this text, we will examine how the media's response to acts of terrorism carried out by Zionist organizations has evolved. We will analyse and compare two such incidents in detail. Firstly, the King David Hotel bombing of 1946, where the Irgun, a pre-state predecessor to the IDF, blew up the headquarters of the British authorities in Palestine, killing 91 and injuring 46. Secondly, an IDF airstrike on the Jabalia Refugee Camp in Gaza on the 31st of October 2023, killing at least 126, including 69 children, and injuring 280. In the British, Arab, and Jewish media, the former was described as a terrorist attack, whereas the latter was not. By analysing the press coverage of both atrocities, this text will question why this is the case. The strike on the Jabalia Refugee Camp was one example of several such attacks, and therefore must be understood in context. At the time of writing, the Jabalia Refugee Camp has endured 11 major military attacks within 2 months. Such a sentence is difficult to even commit to paper. A refugee camp being bombed from the sky, homes being levelled, lives being snatched away. Furthermore, it is difficult, although imperative nonetheless, to maintain the gravity of each incident within the avalanche of the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. Again, this introduction can only provide figures available at the time of writing. At least 15,000 lives taken, many thousands still under the rubble, over 6,000 innocent children murdered, more than 36,000 people injured, 26 out of 35 hospitals shut down, a Shifa hospital under siege with Israeli tanks perched menacingly at the entrance and Israeli snipers shooting nurses through the windows. On November the 11th, in one of the most prescient images of the current escalation and surely a damning indictment of humanity that will resound through the ages, 39 premature babies shared a single bed at Al-Shifa after being removed from incubators which were unable to operate any longer for lack of fuel. By the time the hospital was forcibly evacuated by the Israeli military, 8 had died, taking their final gasps before they ever had a chance to breathe. Inconceivably, all the above is justified by the Israeli government by Hamas's incursion into the Israeli political entity on October 7th and their subsequent military pursuit of the organization. The Israeli narrative is allowed to run riot on Western screens. Here, the double standard is laid bare. Israeli claims, however absurd, are always afforded an air of respectability. So when the Israeli president holds up one laminated card with Al-Qaeda written in English on the front, and another with instructions on how to make chemical weapons, or brandishes a fresh copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, translated into Arabic, with a post-it note on the inside cover, and claims that they were found on the bodies of slain Hamas fighters in children's living rooms, we are expected to listen? And, most pertinently in recent days, accusations that Hamas used the population of Gaza as a collective human shield are repeated ad infinitum without any evidence. Nevertheless, we must not allow the truth to perish under the pounding of Israeli bombs. The recent, heart-wrenching events in Palestine have refocused the world's attention on the brutality and lawlessness of the Israeli political and military apparatus. For Muslims and people of conscience around the world, the footage being broadcast from Gaza specifically has been unbearable to watch. We are living in a new age of media where state-sponsored falsehoods, cover-ups, and acts of terrorism are exposed in real time. However, as this text will examine, the terroristic and genocidal tendencies of the inappropriately named Israeli Defense Forces are not something new. The IDF were formed from the remnants of 3 terrorist organizations. These were terrorist organizations not only by the definition of the Palestinians or the Arab world, but by the definition of the British government too. The Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, or Stern Gang, are proudly held up as the direct predecessors to the IDF. Perhaps appropriately so, for all three have a violent past. As one example of the IDF's terrorist origins, Menachem Begin was a leader of the Irgun, a terrorist paramilitary group, and later the twice Prime Minister of Israel. He was also the founder of the Likud, the largest political party in Israel and home of the fascistic Benjamin Netanyahu, now in his 6th term as Prime Minister. The 7th Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was a leader of the breakaway Lehi faction after their founder, Avraham Stern, was shot and killed whilst being arrested by British police. The question arises, therefore, what has changed? By any fair assessment, the Israeli political entity today would fall under the definition of a terrorist state. Is it the case that the colour of the victim's skin sets the definition? Or is judgment simply determined by whether the perpetrator supports Western interests or not? After all, as George Monbiot said, the West has never been morally consistent, but rather strategically consistent. Defining terrorism. Whenever terrorism is mentioned in this text, I am adhering to the following definition as set by the United Nations. Any action that is intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants, when the purpose of such an act, by its nature or context, is to intimidate a population, or to compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. Zionist violence as a building block of the Israeli political entity. Zionist paramilitary and military organizations have a documented history of violence and brutality against civilian populations, both before and after the establishment of the Israeli political entity. According to David A. Charters in his article on Jewish terrorism and the modern Middle East, it has been difficult for Israeli governments, and for Israeli society as a whole, to acknowledge that some of their founders used terrorism and regarded it as legitimate to do so. This is an inconvenient truth wholly absent from the present debate. When political commentators suggest that the Israeli military are committing acts of terror in Palestine today, it is a claim with decades of precedent to back it up. The Irgun. In October 1944, the US Office of Strategic Services characterized the Irgun, which had been founded in April 1931, as an underground, quasi-military organization with headquarters in Palestine. Fanatical Zionists who wish to convert Palestine and Transjordan into an independent Jewish state, advocate the use of force both against the Arabs and the British to achieve this maximal political goal. The Irgun embarked on a campaign of terror, targeting both British colonial authorities and Palestinian residents. In one incident, 3 Irgun-planted time bombs exploded in the Palestine Broadcasting Studios in Jerusalem during Children's Hour on the 2nd of August 1939. 2 in the control room and a 3rd in one of the studios. Of the 4 wounded in the blasts, Mrs. May Weisenberg, a South African English language announcer, and a Christian Arab employee died of their injuries the following day. Of particular concern to the authorities was that English children usually attended the broadcast in the studio, but on this day, none had arrived. Irgun militants manufactured letter bombs that were mailed to Palestinian civilians in Jaffa, and British police officers were targeted with landmines. An article published in the Birmingham Daily Post on October 12, 1944, headlined, "Palestine Terrorists Warned." References: crimes of violence by Jewish terrorists acting with the deliberate intention of bringing about, by force, developments favourable to the realisation of political aims. An Irgun communique of April 11th, 1948, just over a month before the establishment of the Israeli political entity, warned that Nazi Britain will not rule in our country. The Haganah. According to Charters, The Haganah used violence as a pressure tactic to persuade the British to change their policy on Jewish immigration into Palestine. Despite mentioning the polemic, the striking arm of the Haganah, and the TAS, its illegal arms industry, J.L. Peake claims that although the Haganah were not officially recognized by the British, they were tolerated, as they were perceived to have defensive aims. Perhaps this reflects a British belief that Jewish immigrants had an inherent entitlement to the land of Palestine. As famously committed to history in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a letter signed by the British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour and addressed to Lord Rothschild expressing British support for Jewish Zionist aspirations. In a sentence often overlooked in this document, the indigenous Palestinian majority, indeed the Muslim community, had been the majority in Palestine since the 7th century, are relegated to existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The polemic also took actions against the Irgun and Lehi, who they saw as potentially damaging to the Zionist cause. In February 1945, they kidnapped Yaakov Tarvin, the Irgun's Polish-born head of intelligence, before holding and torturing him at the Ein Harod kibbutz for 6 months. This internecine strife could be seen through a political or practical lens, but Van Tonder notes that many Jews saw their actions as a vendetta against fellow countrymen. He adds that, thanks to their collaboration with the British colonial forces, by the end of the British Mandate, some 440 terrorist suspects had been transported to internment camps in Eritrea, the Sudan, and Kenya. The Lehi. In 1944, Lord Moyne had been appointed by Prime Minister Winston Churchill as British Resident Minister of the Middle East. The Lehi was a splinter group of the Irgun and was headed at this point by Yitzhak Shamir, future Israeli Prime Minister. Shamir personally ordered the assassination of Lord Moyne. On November 6, 1944, 2 Lehi militants shot him as he arrived at his Cairo home, and he succumbed to his wounds the same evening. It is fascinating to contrast Churchill's reaction to the death of his friend and political ally to the pronouncements of the British government today. As reported by the Nottingham Evening Post, and with an air of the white man's burden, Churchill laments the possibility of our dreams for Zionism ending in the smoke of the assassin's pistol, and our labours for its future producing only a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany. To understand the sycophantic Western support for Israeli war crimes in recent times, it is significant to note that Zionism is presented not only as an aspiration of the Zionist movement, but as our dream, too. However, when the victims of Zionist terrorism were British, even the imperialist Churchill, who famously likened the indigenous Palestinian claims to their own land as a dog briefly laying in a manger, was able to denounce them. In light of Israel's collective punishment of the Gaza Strip in recent years, purportedly in retaliation for the actions and/or principles of the elected Hamas government, it is prescient to observe the British colonial authorities' reaction to Lehi operations towards the end of the mandatory period. In April 1948, a Lehi militant cell launched an attack on the British 6th Airborne Division. As Van Tonder describes, the guard tent was bombed and any soldier that moved was fired at. 7 soldiers were killed, 2 of whom were asleep. In reaction, the British division's commander announced that he would impose restrictions on the whole Jewish community. Terrorism as a tactic of the Israeli political entity. Since the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Israeli occupation forces have a proven track record of using violence to achieve political goals. Every innocent life is sacred, but to provide an exhaustive list of such crimes would be impossible. Rather, we will attempt to highlight a few egregious examples that show a pattern in history of unlawful and immoral behavior on the part of the Israeli military machine. The Deir Yassin massacre and Plan Dalet. In the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, Ilan Pape gives a comprehensive account of the systematic expulsion of indigenous Palestinians from their land in the period leading up to and immediately after the establishment of the Israeli political entity. The apogee of this terror campaign was Plan Dalet, when Zionist forces received the following instructions. The villages which you will capture, cleanse, or destroy will be decided according to consultations with your advisors on Arab affairs and the intelligence officers. Although hundreds of Palestinian villages were cleansed between 1948 to 1949, buried under the soil of Israeli cities and towns today, it is the village of Deir Yassin, invaded just over 1 month before the establishment of the Israeli entity, which is remembered above all. Deir Yassin had actually reached a non-aggression pact with the Haganah, but because they were in an area of land designated under Plan Dalet for clearing of Palestinians, its fate was sealed. The Haganah sent the Irgun and Lehi on their behalf. What ensued was a cold-blooded massacre. The witness testimony of Fahim Zaidan, who was 12 years old at the time and survived the attack, is painful to read. They then called my brother Mahmoud and shot him in our presence. And when my mother screamed and bent over my brother, she was carrying my little sister Khadra, who was still being breastfed. They shot my mother too. The Irgun commander Ben Zion Cohen gave a briefer account. We eliminated every Arab that came our way. Albert Einstein and a group of 27 Jewish individuals published a letter in the New York Times condemning the massacre, stating that terrorist bands attacked this peaceful village, which was not a military objective in the fighting, killed most of its inhabitants, 240 men, women, and children, and kept a few of them alive to parade as captives through the streets of Jerusalem. The 240 figure is now seen as an exaggeration deliberately put out by Zionist forces to strike fear into the Palestinian civilian population, with approximately 93 villagers killed, now seen as a more accurate estimate. However, as Ilan Pape points out, and with stark similarities to Israel's current dehumanization of the entire population of Gaza, as the Jewish forces regarded any Palestinian village as an enemy military base, the distinction between massacring people and killing them in battle was slight. Massacres like Deir Yassin laid the foundation for the Israeli state, but the supremacist ideology that motivated them continues until today. The murder of Iman al-Hams. On the 5th of October 2004, 13-year-old Iman al-Hams was walking past an Israeli military outpost in Rafah, Gaza Strip, on her way to school when she was gunned down. A Palestinian eyewitness named Hisham Zurub, aged 20, stated in an affidavit that the girl was as close as 20 meters from the post and suddenly ran back towards us as Israeli soldiers started shooting extensively. In a pattern of behavior that has been repeated many times before and since, the IDF gave an initial account that was later proven to be false. The occupation forces originally said, the soldiers fired warning shots into the air. The figure dropped the bag and fled. The soldiers had no way of knowing it was a girl. The soldiers then fired at and hit the figure. The outcome was grave and regrettable. This was a lie. The commander responsible for the murder initially claimed that he had been shot at by militants and had fired into the ground to deter fire. This was also a lie. First, Israeli media quoted Israeli soldiers from the scene who said that their commander had shot the girl at close range. Then, Israeli television obtained the audio of the following chilling radio exchanges between the commander and his troops. Operations room? Are we talking about a girl under the age of 10? Watchtower. A girl about 10. She's behind the embankment, scared to death. A few minutes later, Iman was shot. The audio continues. Commander, I and another soldier are going in a little nearer, forward, to confirm the kill. The commander then confirmed the kill by emptying the entire magazine of his automatic rifle into Iman's body as she lay on the ground. He then said over the radio, "Anything that's mobile, that moves in the zone, even if it's a 3-year-old, needs to be killed. Over." Unusually, and perhaps due to the testimony given by the other soldiers at the scene, a criminal case was brought against the murderer in the Israeli courts, but he was found not guilty. When the verdict was announced, he burst into tears, turned to onlookers and said, "I told you I was innocent." One report of Iman's death, describing the many bullets that entered her body, stated that so much blood had soaked into her UNRWA school uniform and into the ground where she fell, that her body was nearly bloodless when it finally reached the hospital. The assassination of Razan al-Najjar. The Great March of Return. A series of demonstrations in Gaza between 2018 and 2019, and a physical manifestation of Palestinian attempts to enact their right to return to their homeland, as enshrined in United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3236, which reaffirms the inalienable right of the Palestinians to return to their homes and properties from which they had been displaced and uprooted. Despite the unarmed and legitimate nature of the demonstrations, the Israeli occupation forces responded with what forensic architecture described as an unprecedented use of live ammunition. A commission of inquiry ordered by the UN Human Rights Council noted, lethal force was used by the Israeli security forces against children who posed no imminent threat to soldiers, and in several instances, it was likely that Israeli snipers shot at children intentionally. On the 1st of June 2018, at 6:31 p.m., 20-year-old paramedic Razan al-Najjar was attending one such demonstration, trying to help the injured protesters near the separation fence that encloses Gaza, when she was shot by a single bullet. Razan was walking amongst a team of medics, who were wearing white vests and had their hands in the air, but she was assassinated on the spot. What followed was a pathetic attempt by the Israeli military to demonize an innocent woman using amateurishly edited video evidence that has become a trademark of their narrative. Initially, the Israeli occupation forces stated that Razan had accidentally been shot and that their fire had been aimed at someone else. Then, not satisfied with their actual assassination, they embarked on a character assassination of the martyred paramedic. A 10-second long video clip was released. In the first few seconds, an unidentified female Palestinian medic throws an Israeli-fired tear gas grenade away from demonstrators. Senior Israeli government figures posted a truncated clip of an interview Razan had given to Al-Mayadeen, in which she said, "I am medic Razan al-Najjar. I am here on the front lines, and I act as a human shield." Suddenly, the clip is cut. This was the Israeli justification for murdering a young lady in cold blood. But conveniently, they had omitted the end of her sentence, as a rescuer for the injured on the front lines. Again, in a pattern that is consistently repeated, the falsehoods propagated by the Israeli occupation forces were comprehensively debunked. In an investigation conducted by the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, Rami Abu Jazar, age 29, who was another Palestinian medic who was with Razan as she was shot, gave the following testimony. "We stood about 10 meters away from them, which was about 25 meters away from the fence. There were no protesters near us. At around 5:45 p.m., we saw 2 soldiers get out of a military jeep, kneel and aim their guns at us, taking up a sniper stance. Suddenly, they fired 2 live bullets at us. I looked at Razan and saw her point to her back and then fall down." Furthermore, forensic architecture were commissioned by the New York Times to conduct a detailed spatial analysis of the killing. They said, "By digitally recreating the protest site from video evidence, we used the precise location as a means to derive the trajectory of the bullet and trace its cone of fire back to its origin, a sniper's berm at the border fence." The incidents mentioned above are no more than a drop in the ocean. Nevertheless, this is a vital antidote to the mainstream media's refusal to hold the Israeli occupation forces to account. The IDF have frequently targeted civilians and consistently lied about their actions. The present is tied to the past, and this is the context that must be highlighted when addressing the pain and suffering inflicted on the people of Palestine today. Partnering with apartheid. Not only has the political entity of Israel shown a frequent propensity to engage in acts of terror, both before and after its establishment, but it has also exhibited a willingness to collaborate with fascistic and apartheid regimes. It is worrying that such relationships, although documented and recorded, are considered so taboo as an avenue of inquiry in certain political spheres. The Israeli political entity's ties with apartheid South Africa are both embarrassing and revealing, and for that reason, they have often been brushed under the carpet. In The Unspoken Alliance, Sasha Polakau-Soransky provides an illuminating account of what he characterizes as, at its core, a marriage of interests and ideologies. Polakau-Soransky describes the visit of the apartheid South African Prime Minister Balthazar Vorster to Israel in 1946 as Vorster toured. The Israeli government was still scouring the globe for former Nazis, extraditing or even kidnapping them in order to try them in Israeli courts. Yet Vorster, a man who was once a self-proclaimed Nazi supporter and who had remained wedded to a policy of racial superiority, found himself receiving full red carpet treatment. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ once said, "A man is upon the religion of his best friend, so let one of you look at whom he befriends." The political entity of Israel's relationship with apartheid South Africa should not come as a surprise, for the Israeli entity practices apartheid itself. A case in point is the 1950 Law of Return, which allows any Jewish person in the world, or any person with at least one Jewish grandparent, to move to Palestine and automatically become an Israeli citizen. Palestinians, on the other hand, are afforded no such right, even if they were born there. The absentee property law, passed in the same year, declared land to be abandoned if the owner had been absent for even one day after November 1947. When combined with the mass expulsion of Palestinians that occurred in 1948, this amounts to a legalized mass theft of Palestinian land. Furthermore, a dual legal system in the West Bank means that Israeli settlers are tried in civil courts, whereas Palestinians, including children, are tried in military courts. Indeed, Israel is the only state in the world to try minors in military courts. Despite the overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence, supporters of Zionism often ridicule and denounce parallels between apartheid South Africa and the political entity of Israel. However, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a black South African who had first-hand experience of apartheid during his lifetime, once remarked, "Israel's apartheid is even worse than South Africa's. We never had F-16s bomb our Bantustans, killing hundreds of children." On another occasion, in an interview with David Frost, Tutu suggested that European guilt for the atrocities of the Holocaust contributed to their unyielding support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, suggesting that if they are truly penitent, they ought to be the ones who pay the price of that penitence. The unreliability of Israeli claims. One feature of the media reports we will analyze in this text, particularly in the British and Jewish press, is an unquestioning acceptance of claims made by the Israeli military and government. However, by examining the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, where the unreliability of Israeli claims was gradually revealed over the course of a year, we can conclude that such an acceptance is fundamentally flawed. On May the 11th, 2022, Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was reporting on an Israeli military raid on Jenin, a Palestinian city in the north of the occupied West Bank, when she was assassinated by an Israeli sniper. She was wearing a press vest at the time, standing amongst a group of reporters. Another Al Jazeera journalist, Ali As-Sammoudi, was shot in the back and wounded. As-Sammoudi said that there was no Palestinian military resistance at all at the scene when the two journalists were shot. A second eyewitness, Journalist Shetha Hanesha, who had been standing next to Abu Aqla when she was shot, confirmed that there had been no confrontations between Palestinian fighters and the Israeli military at the time, and stated that the group of journalists had been directly targeted. Hanesha said, "The Israeli occupation army did not stop firing even after she collapsed. I couldn't even extend my arm to pull her because of the shots being fired. The army was adamant on shooting to kill." This was a powerful and significant testimony, for at this point, the Israeli military had denied any involvement in the murder. Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister at the time, offered to conduct a joint pathological investigation with the Palestinian Authority into Abu Aqla's death, but he was immediately rejected. Without offering any evidence, the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett claimed that, "According to the information we have gathered, it appears likely that armed Palestinians were responsible for the unfortunate death of the journalist," even tweeting out a video which was swiftly debunked to bolster his claims. From there onwards, the Israeli government's propaganda division engaged in a rollercoaster ride of untruths. On May 12th, they complained of hasty accusations of Israeli soldiers. On May 13th, they said the perpetrator could have been a soldier firing at a Palestinian fighter who had fired multiple barrages of gunfire and had been next to her. On May 19th, they announced the discovery of a soldier's rifle that may have killed Abu Aqla. And on September 5th, after completing an investigation of itself, the Israeli military declared that there was a high possibility that Abu Aqla had been accidentally hit by their shooting. It was not until the following May, exactly 1 year after her killing, that the IDF apologized for Abu Aqla's death. This could not be excused as ignorance. On the same day as Lapid's platitudes, the Palestinian Authority government spokesperson, Ibrahim Melhem, denounced the killing as deliberate and a comprehensive crime committed against a well-known journalist. A meticulous report published by Forensic Analysis on September 20th established a timeline of events and tracked the trajectory of the bullet, definitively concluding that it was shot from a hole in the side of an Israeli armored vehicle. The Israeli military had lied, and the eyewitnesses had been telling the truth. Shireen Abu Aqla was one Palestinian, an individual amongst millions, but the Israeli reaction to her killing was a familiar story of diversion, delay, and obfuscation. Not only are Palestinians fighting for their lives in the face of a brutal occupation, but they are fighting to overcome a narrative of falsehood with testimony and truth. In the next two sections of this book, examining both the King David Hotel bombing of 1946 and the Jabalia Refugee Camp Massacre of the 31st of October 2023, we will ask how and why the media's reaction to Zionist aggression has changed.